September 11th, 1683, the heights of Kahlenberg overlooking Vienna. The dawn broke red, not with peace, but with warning. Smoke curled from the plains below, where the great city of Vienna lay half swallowed by its own ruins. The smell of burning pitch, sweat, and death drifted through the morning mist. From the hills, tens of thousands of tents stretched across the horizon, the sprawling sea of the Ottoman army. At their center, beneath a pavilion of green silk embroidered with verses of the Quran, sat Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, commander of an empire. His army, more than 150,000 strong, had encircled Vienna for 2 months, pounding its walls with cannon and starvation. The defenders inside the city, barely 11,000 soldiers and a few thousand civilians, were dying slowly. The world believed Vienna doomed. Europe was next. And yet, on this cold September morning from beyond the northern ridge, a new sound began to rise. Not drums, but hooves. King Jan III. Sobieski of Poland reined his horse at the summit of Kahlenberg Hill. His breath formed clouds in the chill air. Before him, the valley stretched wide, the Ottoman camp sprawling like a second city. Beyond it, the faint spires of Vienna pierced the smoke. He was 54, grizzled, scarred, a soldier king who had fought the Turks all his life. His armor gleamed with silver filigree, a white eagle crest upon his breastplate. At his back rode the might of a desperate alliance. Polish, Austrian, German and Italian troops, nearly 70,000 men united for the first time under one banner. Behind him, the winged hussars of Poland stood waiting, the most feared cavalry in Europe, their tall wings of eagle feathers rising from their backs, catching the dawn light like flames. Sobieski's gaze swept the horizon. He knew what everyone else feared to say. Attacking an entrenched Ottoman army larger than his own, down steep, broken slopes, was madness. But he had not ridden 600 miles to watch Europe burn. He dismounted, removed his gauntlets, and knelt in the grass. The chaplain beside him raised a cross of oak and whispered prayers. The army followed, thousands of soldiers kneeling on the wet earth. Sobieski spoke softly, almost to himself. "Into thy hands, O Lord. If this is to be our death, let it be a death that wakes the world." He rose, eyes burning with resolve. "To horse," he said. "Let the Turks feel the wings of the north." The plan he carried in his mind was as daring as it was impossible. The Allied armies, marching separately from Poland, Bavaria and Saxony, had converged just in time to trap the Ottomans between Vienna's walls and the hills of the west. Sobieski's idea was to strike from the high ground, breaking through dense forests, then unleash his cavalry in one overwhelming descent, a single, massive charge from the ridges above the Ottoman camp. No one had ever attempted such a thing. The slopes were steep, tangled with trees. The ground could break legs, shatter formations, and yet Sobieski believed that surprise and faith could accomplish what reason called suicide. As he studied the landscape, an aide approached. "Your Majesty, the German generals await your signal. Shall we wait until the artillery softens their lines?" Sobieski smiled grimly. "If we wait, Vienna will be ash by nightfall. Tell them we attack with the sun." From the valley below came the sound of cannon. The city's defenders, led by Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, still held the crumbling bastions by sheer will. The people of Vienna fought with stones, boiling oil and prayers. Inside the walls, starvation had replaced fear. They knew no relief could come, but as the morning wind shifted, the thunder of hoofbeats reached their ears, faint at first, then growing. The starving garrison climbed the ramparts, eyes straining toward the hills. They saw banners, white eagles, crosses, and they began to weep. High above, the Allied army began its advance. The imperial infantry of Charles of Lorraine moved first, pressing the Ottoman right flank through the vineyards. Bavarian and Saxon troops followed, their muskets flashing among the vines. The Ottomans, startled by the assault from the hills, reeled backward but did not break. Kara Mustafa Pasha emerged from his tent, eyes narrowing at the sight of enemy standards where no army should have stood. His aides shouted orders. The great green flag of the Prophet was raised. Drums pounded through the camp, echoing off the hills like thunder. The battle had begun. Through the day, the fight raged across the slopes. The Allies clawed their way downward, yard by yard. Cannon roared. The smell of powder and grapeshot filled the air. The ground shook beneath the tread of thousands. By late afternoon, the lines had reached the lower ridges. The Ottoman army, though larger, began to stretch thin, caught between fighting uphill and holding the siege lines around the city. Sobieski waited atop the final crest, mounted on a white stallion. Around him, 3,000 Polish hussars, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their wings catching the falling sun. He turned to his men. "Gentlemen, the moment has come. Let us ride, and let the world remember that Poland was here." Down below, Kara Mustafa's lieutenants shouted in confusion. Dust rose along the ridge like a storm. The sun flashed off metal, off feathers, off death itself. Then came the sound, the thunder of hooves, the scream of trumpets, and the roar of the charge. The hussars came down the slope like a wave made of iron. 4 miles of descent, forest, vineyard, smoke, all vanished beneath the storm. Sobieski led them himself, cloak snapping behind him, saber drawn. The air split with their cry, "Jesus Maria, Ratuj! Jesus Mary, save us!" The Ottoman front line buckled. Drums faltered. Soldiers turned, shouting. The impact was like thunder meeting earth. It was the largest cavalry charge in recorded history. Nearly 18,000 riders crashing into the heart of an empire. From the walls of Vienna, the defenders saw the plain erupt in motion. Banners fell, cannons ceased. The Ottoman lines dissolved into panic. Kara Mustafa's army, once the terror of Europe, began to crumble. Horses trampled tents, soldiers fled, carts overturned in the chaos. Sobieski broke through the command line himself, cutting toward the Grand Vizier's pavilion. The green standard fell as the sun dipped below the ridge. By nightfall, the Ottomans were in full retreat. The siege of Vienna, the greatest threat to Christian Europe in a century, was broken. As silence fell, Sobieski dismounted among the wreckage. His horse trembled, foam on its flank. The air stank of gunpowder and sweat. Around him, the dying groaned in every tongue of Europe and Asia. He looked toward the burning city and whispered, "Venimus, vidimus, Deus vicit." That we came, we saw, God conquered. That night, as fires burned across the plain, the Polish king walked among the wounded. He found no joy in victory, only the certainty that history had turned, and that such turns always demand a price. Behind him, the hussars stood silent beneath the stars, wings glinting in the moonlight like the ghosts of angels who had flown too close to war. Night of September 12th, 1683. The plains outside Vienna. The smoke still clung to the earth. The stars were faint behind a haze of gunpowder and ash. Fires burned where tents had stood only hours earlier. Horses wandered riderless among the wreckage, their reins tangled in corpses and broken wheels. From the distance came the muffled sound of church bells, hesitant, unbelieving, as if Vienna itself wasn't sure it still existed. Among the ruins of the Ottoman camp, King Jan III Sobieski stood motionless. Around him lay the remains of an empire's pride, silks torn, cannon overturned, jeweled saddles trampled into the mud. The air smelled of sweat, smoke, and the faint sweetness of burned sugar, the rations of a defeated army. Behind him, his generals approached carefully, reluctant to disturb his silence. Sobieski's eyes were fixed on a fallen banner, green silk embroidered with gold Quranic verses. He bent to lift it, brushing the dust away. "This," he murmured, "was once the shadow that covered Europe." He handed it to an aide. "Now it is only cloth." The next morning the sunlight broke over a world reborn. Vienna's gates opened at last. Survivors poured out, gaunt faces, ragged clothes, the smell of sickness and gunpowder still clinging to them. They knelt before Sobieski as he rode into the shattered city, his armor dull from battle, his horse limping slightly. The people cheered, wept, reached for his hands. Priests chanted Te Deum. The sound rolled like thunder through the ruined streets. To them he was not merely a king, he was deliverance itself. At the Cathedral of St. Stephen, Sobieski dismounted and entered barefoot, head bowed. The floor was cracked, the walls blackened by cannon smoke. A single shaft of light fell through the broken roof, illuminating the altar. He knelt there, whispering a prayer only he could hear. "Lord, you gave me courage. Give me now the wisdom not to waste it." By midday, the Allied commanders assembled in what had once been Kara Mustafa's grand pavilion. Inside, luxury still clung to ruin. Gold-threaded cushions, silver hussars, parchment maps strewn across the floor. Sobieski sat at the center, still in his dented armor. To his right, Charles of Lorraine. To his left, the German princes who had ridden under his command. The air was thick with triumph and tension. Charles spoke first. "Your Majesty, all Christendom owes you its life. Your charge has saved Vienna, and perhaps the world." Sobieski nodded politely but said nothing. He saw in Charles's eyes the calculation behind the praise, gratitude mixed with fear. A Polish king had just outshone emperors. Politics, he thought bitterly, always survived the battlefield. Outside, the captured spoils were piled high, silk tents, jeweled armor, Ottoman cannon, even the green banner of the Prophet. Soldiers marveled at treasures they had never seen, carpets, spices, and coins stamped with Arabic script. One Polish officer whispered, "We fought the end of the world," and found paradise in their wagons. Sobieski overheard. "Paradise," he said quietly. "No, just what men build before they forget the cost." That evening, he rode once more to the ridge at Kahlenberg, where the battle had begun. From there, the entire valley lay visible. The scars of trenches, the broken siege lines, the smoke still curling into the sunset. Beside him rode his son, Prince Jakub. The young man stared at the landscape in awe. "Father," he said, "they said it couldn't be done, that the Turks were too many, too strong." Sobieski smiled faintly. "Everything seems impossible until you've done it once. Then it becomes history." He paused, watching the horizon. "But remember this, my son, history has no gratitude, only memory." Far to the east, in Belgrade, the news reached the Ottoman court like a dagger. Couriers rode day and night, their horses collapsing beneath them, bearing one message only: Kara Mustafa has failed. In the imperial palace, Sultan Mehmed IV received the news in silence. His eyes darkened. "He has shamed the empire," he said at last. "He has failed Allah and the Prophet." A week later, a silk cord was sent to Kara Mustafa's camp. By Ottoman custom, the punishment for failure of this scale was not exile, it was strangulation. Thus ended the man who had carried the crescent banner to Vienna's walls. His death, quiet and ritual, mirrored the silence of the city he had nearly conquered. Across Europe, the reaction was thunderous. From Rome to Krakow, bells rang for days. Poets called Sobieski the savior of Christendom. Painters rushed to capture the moment. The Polish king kneeling in the ruins, the winged hussars descending like divine wrath. Yet amid the praise, Sobieski wrote a single letter to his wife, Queen Marie Casimir. His words were simple, without triumph. "God gave victory to our arms, my beloved, but what I saw, no glory can sweeten it. The world calls it salvation, I call it exhaustion." Weeks passed. The dead were buried in great pits outside the walls. The stench of decay gave way slowly to autumn air. Life began to return to the streets. Merchants reopened stalls, children played among broken stones, church bells replaced cannon fire. Yet Sobieski did not remain. His duty was finished here, but his heart was already turning homeward. Before leaving, he met Emperor Leopold I, who returned to Vienna now that it was safe. The meeting was ceremonial, polite, and cold. Leopold, wary of a Polish king hailed as Europe's savior, greeted him stiffly. "We thank His Majesty for his service to Christendom." Sobieski bowed. "I did not serve Christendom, Your Imperial Majesty. I served necessity." Their eyes met, two men who understood that victory does not erase ambition. On his final night in Vienna, Sobieski walked alone through the quiet streets. He passed burned houses, shattered fountains, and the faces of the living, eyes hollow from siege, yet filled with wonder that dawn still came. At the edge of the city, he looked back one last time. The moon hung over the broken walls like a silver wound. He whispered, "Europe lives tonight, but how long can one victory hold back time?" Then he turned his horse northward, toward Krakow, toward home. As he rode away, the legend of Vienna began to spread, faster than any messenger could carry. In taverns and courts, they told of a mad king who led angels from the hills to crush an empire. They spoke of the hussars with wings of fire, of the thunder that rolled down from Kahlenberg like the wrath of heaven. And in every telling the story grew, more miracle than memory. But Sobieski himself knew the truth. He had not destroyed the Ottomans, he had only stopped them. The empire still stretched from the Balkans to Baghdad. The storm had merely changed direction. Still, for one moment in history, the impossible had been done. Autumn, 1683, Krakow, the royal castle of Wawel. The banners of victory hung heavy in the halls. Their silks gleamed in candlelight, stitched with the spoils of the Ottoman camp. Green, gold, red. Courtiers filled the corridors, whispering of triumphs and miracles. But King Jan III Sobieski felt only the ache of distance. The war was not over. The armies had scattered, the Allies returned home, and Europe, newly saved, was already dividing the spoils of gratitude. In his study, Sobieski bent over maps spread across a long oak table. The Balkans, the Danube, the Black Sea frontier. His ink-stained fingers traced the curved border where Christendom and Islam had collided for centuries. He knew the victory at Vienna had broken the spell of Ottoman invincibility, but not the empire itself. Wars, he thought, are not ended by one field of blood. They end when memory changes sides. Outside, winter clouds gathered over the city. In the courtyards below, veterans limped through the snow, their armor patched, their faces marked by smoke and years. Children ran after them, shouting, "The heroes of Vienna!" The soldiers smiled but said nothing. They knew the cost of heroism too well. Sobieski watched from the window. "The world praises us," he murmured to his aide, "but praise feeds no soldier. I fear the next war will be fought with empty stomachs and full pride." Meanwhile, in Istanbul, the empire reeled. The death of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa had not healed the wound. It had deepened it. The court was filled with silence and fear. The Sultan's advisers argued, provinces whispered of rebellion, the Janissaries muttered of omens. For the first time in a century, the Ottoman court faced something it did not understand: defeat. Chroniclers wrote that the Sultan walked the palace gardens in silence, staring toward the western sky, as if he could still see the smoke of Vienna there. The word spread through the bazaars, "The Turks can be beaten." A sentence that had once seemed unthinkable now passed from mouth to mouth like wildfire. In Rome, Pope Innocent V declared the victory divine. From his balcony, he spoke to the crowd in St. Peter's Square. "The hand of God has struck through the courage of the Polish king. The crescent has been humbled before the cross." But even as he spoke, ambassadors from Vienna, Venice, and Warsaw began to quarrel about who had truly led the charge, whose banners had been first, whose cannon had opened the breach. The Holy League, born from fear, was already showing the cracks of success. Sobieski understood what they did not. Alliances built on survival rarely survive victory. By early 1684, the war had reignited across Hungary. The Ottoman frontier trembled under new campaigns. Christian forces pushed south, eager to claim their share of triumph, while the Ottoman armies, still vast, still formidable, fought to recover ground. From Krakow, Sobieski sent troops, but remained cautious. He knew the storm was not yet broken, only scattered. He wrote to his generals, "The Turks are wounded, but not dying." An empire does not collapse from one defeat, only from forgetting why it fights. In Belgrade, Ottoman officers gathered around maps much like Sobieski's. The same rivers, the same mountains, only reversed. A young commander pointed at the Danube. "They think us finished," he said. "Let them believe it. The lion sleeps, but his claws remain." And indeed, the Ottomans struck back. Raids flared across Transylvania. Border towns burned again. Armies shifted like tides. The war that Sobieski had hoped to end became a chain reaction stretching for decades. The Great Turkish War, the final struggle of the old empire to hold Europe. But even amid the blood, something deeper was changing. In cities once shadowed by fear, bells rang without dread. Merchants reopened routes long closed by conquest. Across Europe, a strange confidence took root, a belief that the eastward tide could be reversed, that faith, technology, and courage could bend the course of history. For the first time in centuries, Europe began to move outward again, trading, expanding, dreaming of empire. The fall of one invincible power had awakened another. Sobieski watched this with a heavy heart. He saw in the celebration the seed of future arrogance. He saw nations feasting on victory as though it were endless. In a letter to his queen, he confessed, "I fear we have slain one storm only to summon another, for man does not conquer. He inherits the ruins of his enemy." He had dreamed of a united Europe defending its faith and freedom. What he saw instead was rivalry dressed as gratitude. Still, there were moments of quiet pride. In 1686, his son Jakub rode beside him to a military review in Warsaw. The hussars paraded in perfect lines, feathers brushing the wind, armor gleaming under the sun. The crowd roared. Jakub leaned close. "Father, do you think they will remember us?" Sobieski smiled faintly. "Yes, but not as we are. They will remember the story, not the cost, and perhaps that is mercy." In the east, the Ottoman banners still flew, but their shadow was thinner. The empire had lost not only men and ground, it had lost the illusion of destiny. For centuries the world had believed the Ottomans moved with the will of heaven. After Vienna, heaven was silent. Poets in Istanbul began to write verses of sorrow and nostalgia, the tone of a civilization looking backward for the first time. "We once were the thunder that moved mountains," one wrote. "Now we are the echo." In the years that followed, the balance of the world shifted. The Habsburgs advanced into Hungary. Venice seized fortresses along the coast. Russia looked southward toward the Black Sea. The Ottoman Empire, once the heart of expansion, began to shrink, slowly, painfully, like a tide pulling away from land. And in every chronicle, the turning point had the same name: Vienna, 1683. One cold evening, years after the battle, Sobieski stood again at the window of Wawel Castle. Outside, the snow fell in silence. He held a small object in his hands, a feather from the wing of a hussar's armor browned with age. He remembered the charge, the thunder, the fire. He remembered the impossible becoming real. He whispered, "Even angels tire of flying." His reflection stared back at him, older, slower, but still burning with that same impossible defiance. History would later paint the Battle of Vienna in gold, the moment the West was saved, the day the East was broken. But the truth, like the battlefield, was layered in dust and blood. What fell that day was not merely an army, but an idea that any empire, no matter how vast, could claim eternity. Sobieski's charge did more than save a city. It reminded the world that even giants fall, and that when they do, the ground trembles for centuries. Krakow, winter of 1686. Snow fell softly on the roofs of Wawel Castle, blanketing the world in quiet white. From the throne room, faint music drifted through the corridors, court musicians rehearsing hymns of victory that no longer stirred their king. Jan III Sobieski, the savior of Europe, sat by the fire, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak. The flames reflected in his eyes, but the warmth did not reach his thoughts. Outside, the city buzzed with stories of glory. Inside, he heard only silence, the kind that follows applause when the audience has already turned away. The great alliances he had forged before Vienna were crumbling. The German princes quarreled over borders. The Pope urged new crusades. The Austrians marched deeper into Hungary, claiming the spoils of the war he had won. And Poland, proud, poor, divided, drifted back into its old chaos. Sobieski knew it well. Victories fade faster than they are sung. Letters arrived from Vienna, Venice, and Rome. Praise, flattery, promises. But none brought soldiers, silver, or loyalty. In one letter from Emperor Leopold, polite as a dagger, came a line that cut deep. His Imperial Majesty rejoices that divine providence employed your Majesty's arms for the protection of Christendom. Employed. The word stung. It was as if he had been a tool, not a king, a sword borrowed, then returned to its scabbard. He folded the letter carefully and set it into the fire. That spring, he rode once more through the Polish countryside. The fields were green again, alive with farmers and children. Birds wheeled over the plains, and church bells rang in the distance. Here, far from courts and crowns, his fame meant something simple: safety. Men could plough without fear. Women could sleep without the sound of distant drums. He stopped by a small village chapel, built hastily from salvaged wood. Inside hung a crude painting, a Polish knight on a white horse, his wings of feathers glowing in sunlight, trampling the crescent beneath his hooves. The villagers knelt when they saw him. One old woman kissed his hand. "God sent you to save us," she whispered. Sobieski smiled, but his eyes dimmed. "No, my lady," he said softly. "God sent us to save ourselves." Back in Krakow, his council spoke of politics, treaties, trade, taxes. He listened with half an ear. The real world, he thought, rarely cared for the truths found on battlefields. He found solace in letters to his wife, Queen Marie Casimir, now living abroad. Their words were both tender and weary. "My dearest heart," he wrote, "I am surrounded by those who praise me in public and forget me in private. I do not regret Vienna, but I see now that even great deeds vanish like footprints in snow. Still, I would do it again. For the world, for you, for the chance to prove that madness and faith can sometimes be the same thing." In Istanbul, the empire he had defeated was changing. The Sultan, weary of war, replaced viziers and generals in a desperate attempt to restore order. The Ottoman banners no longer reached the walls of Europe, but within their vast borders, life continued. Mosques filled at dawn, markets hummed. The empire retreated, but it did not collapse. Sobieski's impossible plan had done something subtler than destruction. It had restored balance. For the first time in centuries, East and West stood as equals, wary, wounded, but alive. History, he realized, did not deal in victory or defeat. It dealt in survival. The following year, in Vienna, the emperor commissioned a great fresco to commemorate the battle. Artists painted cherubs and saints, halos and angels carrying swords. In the center stood Leopold himself, radiant, triumphant, while Sobieski, smaller, bowed humbly at his feet. When news of the painting reached Krakow, the Polish court seethed. "They steal your glory, Majesty," cried one minister. Sobieski only laughed. "Let them. Glory cannot be stolen. It can only be misunderstood." Then, more quietly, And misunderstanding is the currency of kings. As the years passed, illness crept upon him. The old war wounds stiffened his limbs. The winters grew colder. He spent long evenings in his library, surrounded by books on astronomy, philosophy, and war. Visitors often found him gazing at the stars through a brass telescope. When asked what he saw, he would smile faintly. "The same thing I saw at Vienna," he said. "Endless distance and the smallness of men." In the autumn of 1695, Sobieski travelled to Wilanów Palace, his summer residence outside Warsaw. The gardens were overgrown, the fountains dry. He walked slowly among them, cane in hand. He paused before a statue of an angel trampling a serpent, the same image that had once crowned his battle banners. The wings were chipped, the marble faded. He ran a gloved hand along the stone and said to no one, "So even angels age." That night, as rain tapped against the windows, he called for his chaplain. "I have fought enough," he said. "The rest is in God's hands." In his final days, he spoke often of the charge, of the wind, the thunder, the moment the impossible became real. He told his attendants, "When you remember me, remember not the battle but the choice, that I rode when the world said wait, that I believed when reason said run." His last words, according to those present, were barely a whisper. God conquered, but man must keep believing. He died on June 17th, 1696, at the age of 66. After his death, Poland mourned. Bells tolled across the plains. Processions filled the streets of Krakow. Yet even in grief, the world moved on. Wars continued. Borders shifted. Names changed. But the legend endured, not because it was written, but because it was needed. The idea that one man, one charge, one act of impossible courage could alter the course of history, that idea refused to die. Decades later, travelers to Vienna would still visit the hill of Kahlenberg. They would stand where the hussars once gathered, feeling the wind that carried their echo. Some said, if you listened closely, you could still hear it. The low thunder of hooves, the whisper of feathers through air, the cry of men who rode into history and vanished within it. Sobieski's victory reshaped the world in ways no army could see. The Ottoman Empire began its long retreat. The Habsburgs expanded eastward. Europe, safe at last, turned its gaze outward, to the seas, to the colonies, to the world beyond its own horizon. Vienna was not just the fall of one empire, it was the birth of another age. And somewhere in the silence of time, between the clash of swords and the whisper of pen on parchment, the voice of a Polish king still lingers. Even the impossible, once done, becomes the duty of those who follow. Vienna, 300 years later, dawn over the city. The sun rises softly on domes and spires that once trembled beneath cannon fire. Streetcars rattle over cobblestones. The air smells of bread and coffee. Nothing in this calm modern city remembers the fear that once lived here, except perhaps the hill beyond the Danube, where the wind still moves through the grass as it did that morning in 1683. At Kahlenberg stands a small chapel. Inside, a worn plaque bears the name of a Polish king. Few stop to read it. Fewer still remember that the fate of a continent once turned on the courage of one man's impossible plan. But history remembers, quietly, beneath the noise of progress. September 1683. That day, the world changed course. For the Ottomans, the defeat at Vienna was not merely a lost battle. It was the end of a century of invincibility. The empire that had stretched from the gates of Persia to the walls of Hungary would never again cross so far into Europe. For the West, it was something else, a beginning. The myth of unstoppable empire had broken. The idea of Europe, fragmented, fragile, yet resilient, had survived long enough to imagine itself as one. And in that narrow survival, a new kind of destiny began to form, not of faith alone, but of ambition. Within a generation, the balance of power had shifted. The Ottoman border retreated southward, fortress by fortress. The Habsburgs filled the vacuum with empire. Trade flourished along the Danube. Vienna grew rich, polished, imperial, the heart of a new age. But as the old threat vanished, so too did the unity it had forced. Without the shadow of the Crescent, Europe turned its rivalries inward. France and England, Spain and Austria. The wars returned, not against invaders, but between brothers. Sobieski's victory had saved Europe. It had also freed it to destroy itself in new ways. In Istanbul, the defeat rippled like an aftershock. The poets called it the wound of the West. The Janissaries muttered that the empire had offended heaven. For the first time, Ottoman chroniclers wrote not of expansion, but of memory, of lost glory, lost purpose. And yet, amid the sorrow, something remarkable began. The empire adapted, it reformed its armies, reimagined its bureaucracy, rebuilt its trade. From defeat rose reflection, and from reflection, survival. The Ottomans did not vanish, they transformed. In Poland, meanwhile, the light that had burned so brightly with Sobieski's name began to fade. His sons quarreled. His heirs lacked his strength. By the next century, the great Commonwealth he had fought for, the union of Poland and Lithuania, would itself be partitioned, carved by the same Europe he had once saved. It was the oldest irony in history. The savior of Europe had saved an idea that would later consume his own homeland. But legends live where borders die. For generations, Polish children learned his name like a prayer. Painters imagined him as a knight of divine fire, charging through clouds of smoke, his white eagle crest gleaming in sunlight. Poets wrote that his sword did not swing, it sang, and in every retelling, the truth of him blurred into myth. Not the aging king with aching bones and doubts, but the eternal rider, the man who made the impossible happen. Across Europe, Vienna became a symbol, not just of victory but of resilience. A line had been drawn in history. Before Vienna, fear ruled. After Vienna, destiny belonged to those who dared. That belief would drive explorers across oceans, scientists across the unknown, empires across continents. It would also lead to arrogance, conquest, and the very divisions Sobieski had hoped to prevent. But in the heart of that contradiction lay the essence of humanity, the refusal to surrender, even when logic demands it. Centuries later, when Europe again faced darkness, when wars returned, when cities burned, when nations fell, people whispered the old stories. They remembered the man who rode when others waited, who believed when faith itself seemed broken. They remembered Kahlenberg and the wings that swept down from heaven. In the ashes of newer wars, Vienna's bells rang again, and with them came the echo, "It has been done before." One historian wrote, Sobieski's victory was not the end of an empire, but the reminder that empires end. Another added, he fought not against Islam, nor for Christendom, but for the right of men to choose their own fate. And perhaps that is his truest legacy, not in flags or thrones, but in the belief that courage can rewrite inevitability. Modern day. On the hill of Kahlenberg, the grass bends in the wind, brushing against a single stone cross. Tourists stand with cameras, unaware that beneath their feet lie the bones of thousands who fought beneath two suns, one crescent, one cross. The valley below glows golden in the morning light. The city hums, alive, unafraid. A small plaque reads simply, Venimus, vidimus, Deus vicit. We came, we saw. God conquered. 3 centuries later, the words still carry the quiet weight of defiance and of humility. If you listen closely, as the wind rushes through the trees, you might still hear it, a faint thunder rolling through time. The wings, the hooves, the heartbeat of men who refuse to yield. And in that sound lives the true legacy of Jan Sobieski. Not a savior, not a conqueror, but a man who proved that faith and reason, courage and madness can stand side by side at the edge of the impossible. The Ottoman banners fell. Empires rose and vanished. Europe changed forever. But courage never goes out of style.